welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files. Good morning, Louie.
Good morning, Matthew.
And good morning today to our special guest. So, Louie, maybe you would like to introduce our guest today?
Yes, sure. Well, today we are kindly joined by award-winning science writer, I'm going to say Dr. Oren Harman, or Professor Oren Harman. He wrote, I know Oren's work through his very interesting book, The Price of Altruism, which is about the sorry tale of George Price. So hopefully we're going to ask Oren to tell us a little bit about George Price today. But we'll say, Oren, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? Or?
Sure. I was born in Jerusalem a few years ago and grew up mainly in Israel, but also a bit in New York City. I have a doctoral degree from Oxford University. I studied biology and history all throughout my degrees and sort of couldn't decide between the two, whether I wanted to work in a lab or amongst archives. And so I somehow ended up combining the two by not really making a decision. And so I'm interested in biological thought, in particular in evolutionary theory, but also in genetics and in their philosophy and history. And I write books and teach for a living.
So
I have a 3-year-old daughter. My youngest daughter is called Connie. You are what she would call a clever clogs. It's official. So
all
that's
right.
good. I'm feeling suitably intimidated. So again, I'm going to allow Louie to ask some questions. So, and I'm saying, I know from some of the listeners, I'm assuming we have plural listeners here, but what I thought was a really good introduction to some of the topics that we will hopefully talk about is the TED talk that you gave. So the great TED talk, which talks about some of George Price's work and altruism. So that's where I'd like to pick up some of the discussion. But first of all, Louie, maybe again, if you can set the ball rolling for us.
do you want to tell us a little bit about George Price, or what attracted you to his story then, Oren?
Sure.
Does that sound?
So this was back, I guess, in 1998 or something like that. I was at Oxford at the time, and I came across a sort of short, almost a one-liner about a man who had written a mathematical equation which solved the problem of altruism and then killed himself for reasons having to do with the equation.
And was this, sorry, if I could ask, is this in Matt Ridley's Origin of Virtue? Is that where you saw that, or?
No, it wasn't in Matt Ridley's Origin of Virtue. No, it was somewhere else. A guy by the name of Andrew Brown had written it somewhere. But there was very little information attached to the claim, and it seemed quite mysterious. And it sort of stuck in the back of my head. I was working at the time on a completely different project having to do with the evolutionary synthesis and the role of chromosomes, chromosome mechanics in evolutionary theory. But years later, I was back in Israel, and I was sort of a kind of I would write essay reviews for the New Republic, and a book came across my table. And its title was The Altruism Equation by this guy, Lee Dugatkin, who's a biologist in the United States. And over there was a slightly more fleshed out account of the life of George Price and his doings. And so I read that. It was about 10 pages long. And it seemed to refer to reference to a biography of George Price written by a man by the name of Jim Schwartz. And so I contacted this guy, Jim Schwartz, and it turned out that his biography was all of 10 pages. But he was a very interesting character himself, was an applied mathematician who became a writer. And I called him up one day and I said, I've read your 10-page article in the now defunct Lingua Franca, which used to be a very good journal. And it's quite amazing. It's an amazing story. And I've become interested in George Price. And there was sort of a silence on the other end of the line. And he said, I've grown, after about 30 seconds, I've grown quite close to George Price. And I knew that George Price had killed himself 40 years earlier. And so clearly there was something, powerful about this character. And Anyone coming close to him was really impressed by his life, and so we got to talking. He didn't really want to let go of this man to begin with, because the story really wasn't very well known. And finally I said, well, are there papers to work from? Is there anything, this is only 10 pages and it seems like this is quite an extraordinary life, and dealt with some very important ideas. And finally, very, very generously, he said, well, I can give you the phone number of his daughters, both of whom live on the west coast of the United States, and you can take it from there. I don't think there's much to work with. But have a crack. And so finally I reached the daughters, and after about 3 or 4 months of very long transatlantic conversations in which they related to me that many people had over the years, again, he'd killed himself in 1975, so over the years people had contacted them, different types of people, filmmakers and thespians and writers and science people, but they sort of kept it very close to their chests. And finally, they invited me to their homes to look at the papers. And when I arrived, this was, I guess, sometime in 2008. I found in both the dens of these two daughters, Anne-Marie and Kathleen, a treasure trove of thousands and thousands of letters, papers, journals, scribbles that George had left behind him. And from that treasure trove, I began my attempt to sort of piece together the story of his life, which is the following. George Price was born in 1922 in England and killed himself in a squat in Kentish Town in London in 1975, in the winter of 1975. And he really was kind of the real world Forrest Gump. In other words, he found himself kind of at the center of great technological and scientific revolutions in the 20th century, solving problems, but sort of scurrying off before anyone could figure out who he was, and turning to a completely different problem. So he had worked on the atom bomb project, the Manhattan Project, as a PhD hopeful at the University of Chicago during the war. Made an important contribution there, but then moved over to a completely different field, to the to work at Bell Labs, working on germanium crystals in the telecommunications revolutions with people like Shockley and Bardeen, sort of the fathers of the telecommunication revolution. Solved an important problem there. Left that, moved to Minnesota to work on cancer research at one of the centers of cancer research of the world at that time, and developed a method to detect tumors with porphyrins. Again, an important contribution, but left that altogether. In the interim, he was a staunch atheist, a total rationalist, thought the idea of God was complete malarkey, but nevertheless married an extremely devout Catholic woman, against the kind of well wishes of all of his friends. And while at Minnesota, that marriage, which had already produced the two daughters that I mentioned before, began to break up, and he left everything behind and moved to the Village in New York City. This is the 60s, the roaring 60s, did a lot of drugs. And in between sort of bouts of highs and lows on Benzodrids, he invented what became known as computer-aided design, or CAD, the ability of a computer to manipulate an object three-dimensionally. Was a terrible businessman, didn't take out a patent. IBM took the idea and made billions and billions and trillions of billions. None of the coins ever found themselves in his pocket, but he joined IBM as a kind of low-rung worker. He was a very extremely genius, but kind of otherworldly, very bad at kind of human relations. Probably was somewhere on the spectrum, and I can tell you some funny anecdotes later about my exploits with his daughters years later. But in any case, at a certain point in time in the mid 60s, he he finds out that he has cancer, and he's operated on, and the operation is a success, but he falls into a depression, and he really decides that he doesn't want to live anymore. And somehow becomes convinced that before he leaves this world, he wants to solve one big, great problem. Just before this happened, he had been corresponding with 4 Nobel laureates in 4 separate fields. Samuelson in economics, H.J. Muller in genetics, with Shockley in information theory, and with Eccles in neurophysiology. And to each he had been sending solutions to really basic fundamental problems. And each of them replied to him thinking that in a kind of, this is extremely interesting, but you're obviously not trained in the field. Why didn't you go back to school and learn the language of the disciplines? But this is interesting, and good luck to you. So he was extremely ambitious, thought he was kind of put on this earth to solve some great scientific or technological problem. And finally, from his getting better, from recuperating from his cancer surgery, he decided that the problem that he wanted to solve, of all problems, was the great problem of the origins of kindness, or where altruism comes from, which was a problem that was designated by Darwin, Charles Darwin, in the 19th century as the greatest threat to his theory of evolution. Because how do you explain the persistence of kindness in nature, or of altruism, more specifically, if evolution is a game of survival of the fittest? Altruism, by definition, is an action which reduces one's fitness. You give someone else a fitness benefit while incurring a fitness cost. That turns you into an altruist. And it turns out that in nature, from amoeba to plants to lizards to birds to mammals, all the way up to us, there is an enormous amount of altruism in nature across all the taxa. And that would seem to be a paradox, because you would expect natural selection to kick out all such behavior if it reduces the fitness of the organism carrying that behavior. And so Darwin thought that this was a great enigma. He had a solution himself to the problem. But in fact, science was not entirely convinced by Darwin's solution. And for at least 100 years, since Darwin wrote about altruism, although he didn't call it by that name, he called it sacrifice, different scientists of different kinds, economists, psychologists, obviously mathematical population geneticists, animal behaviorists, had all been trying to solve the problem. And George Price now, from his hospital bed recuperating from cancer, decides with great hubris that he will be the one to solve it, even though he has no training in the field. He was a chemist who had worked, as I said, at the Manhattan Project on uranium enrichment. So he has no background in evolutionary theory or biology, really, to speak of. And yet he decides to get on a boat in November 1967. Again, he's abandoned his family and his daughters to move to London, where he lands in the winter of 67, 68, and to solve this incredibly trenchant and difficult problem, and very fundamental problem too. Where does sacrifice, where does kindness ultimately come from? And he takes an apartment off of Oxford Circus and begins reading the relevant papers in the late opening public libraries. No one knows who he is. He has no affiliation of any kind to any university or anything else. He's there on his own dime. And within a very, very short period of a few months, about 3-4 months, he comes across a famous paper by Bill Hamilton, the great Bill Hamilton, who will later be called the Darwin of the 20th century by many people, great genius of evolutionary theory, in which he makes a claim about where altruism comes from. And to simplify somewhat, but I think it catches the essence of the matter, he says that altruism comes from nepotism. So the closer two organisms are genetically to one another, the more altruism we will expect to see between them. Now, this is a notion which was later popularized by Richard Dawkins in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, but it's basically looking at evolution from the point of view of the gene. which is to say that our bodies don't matter. What matters are the genes that are carried within our body vehicles, and so if you help another who's related to you, in other words, who shares the same genes that you have in your body, and that other person succeeds fitness-wise because of your assistance, then it doesn't matter that you pay a cost, just so long as you've helped him in a matter that reproduces those same genes at least as much as if you would have kept your own fitness. An easy way to say it was once. This is an apocryphal story, but the great geneticist J.B.S. Haldane was once in a pub in London, and he was asked. Someone after the 15th beer screamed at him, "JBS, would you jump into a river to save your brother?" And JBS said, "No, but I would jump into the river to save 2 brothers and 8 cousins." So that's the calculus of the of the selfish gene, and this was Hamilton's idea. And George Price read it one night late in Holborn, in the library, and he wrote to Hamilton out of the blue and said, "My name is George Price. I've come from America to solve the problem of altruism. Your paper is very interesting, but I think there's a mistake in it. Could you please send me a reprint?" And Hamilton was at that time on his way to the Brazilian rainforests to study social wasps, and didn't have much time and didn't know who this person was, and actually didn't have a reprint to send out. So he wrote back gentlemanly and said, "This is very interesting. Here's a reprint of another paper, and good luck to you," and thought nothing of the matter, and was off to Brazil. And half a year later, he came back and found on his table what became known historically as the Price equation. Because Price, thinking about it some more and reading a bit more and thinking and reading and thinking and reading, ultimately wrote an equation, which to some minds is the greatest and most penetrating solution to the problem of altruism in a formal sense. And when he wrote it, he actually walked off of the street into UCL to ask the guard where the biostatistics professor is, was sent to the room of C.A.B. Smith, who happened to be Hamilton's old professor, showed him the equation. Again, off the street, Smith had no idea who this person was. And within the hour had keys to his own office and an honorary professorship at what was at the time one of the leading genetic centers in the world. Interestingly and dramatically, what happened next was that he went home and started thinking about what had just happened. And it seemed to him quite amazing that of all the great minds since Darwin who have been trying to crack this conundrum, he would have come up with such an elegant and short mathematical solution, someone who had no background in the field and really came out of nowhere. And so it seemed to him a great coincidence. And I mentioned earlier that he was a great rationalist, maybe too much of a rationalist. So he started thinking of other coincidences that had happened to him in his lifetime in a mathematical sense. So he'd had 4 girlfriends whose name was Anne. The last 4 digits of his phone number on Little Titchfield Road were 2399, which he interpreted obviously idiosyncratically to be a moment before midnight. So he has to get going. He multiplied all this, and it came out an astronomical number, 1/10 to the minus 30th, meaning that there was a minuscule chance that all these things should have happened to him. And so he did what he thought was the only rational thing to do, faced with such evidence, which was to run out of his apartment, down Little Titchfield Road into All Souls at Langham, right by BBC Radio Today, beautiful church, and prostrated himself, fell on his knees, and became an evangelical Christian on the spot, having come to the conclusion through statistics that he had been chosen by God to bring a great truth to humanity, namely where kindness comes from. Now, the next and last chapter in George Price's very dramatic and tragic life was that he began thinking about the equation philosophically. And having just become a Christian, it seemed to him that the meaning of the equation, and again, this is his interpretation, so it's not a necessary interpretation, and I guess we can talk about it a little bit ourselves and see what we think. But his interpretation was that if you could write a mathematical a formal solution to the problem of the evolution of altruism. What that meant about altruism was that it wasn't what you thought it was. That altruism was in fact a form of selfishness. Later, someone coined the aphorism: "Scratch an altruist and watch an egoist bleed." And this was basically the solution, the interpretation that that Price drew from his own mathematics. And so this was a terrible realization for someone who had just become a Christian. And so he decided to really prove that his own spirit, the human spirit, could transcend his own miraculous mathematics and do better than the sort of second best kind of kindness that nature had produced. And so he went out to the streets of London. This is the early 70s, and started the life of a radical altruist. He began giving out money and food and legal help to the downtrodden of London, Euston Square, Soho. Finally, he invited people to live with him in his home off the street, some of whom were quite unfriendly and violent to him as well. But he felt a great joy, because this meant to him that he was transcending his own mathematics, that he was proving that the human spirit can actually transcend the evolutionary process and really achieve true selflessness. The end of the story is probably what you would expect. Having given away everything, he himself was left with nothing and was thrown out of his apartment into the streets, was living on the streets, living rough. And finally, in January 1975, in a squat in Kentish Town, which happened to be populated by two sort of bohemian Israeli soldiers who had just gotten out of their army service and were in London, doing drugs and making art. I tracked them down, by the way, so they told me this story. He slit his throat. He cut his throat with a pair of scissors. And the scene that opens the book is the scene of his funeral, in which no more than 10 people partook, at least half of whom were his last companions on the streets of London, upon whom he had descended as an uncalled angel. And then two of the people present were Bill Hamilton, the great Darwin of the 20th century, and John Maynard Smith, another of the giants of evolutionary theory of the second half of the 20th century, both of whom had recognized George Price's genius. At the time, they were probably the only people in the world to have recognized, really to have penetrated the depth of his thinking. But they came to show their last respects to a man whom they respected very highly, and both of whom tried to save him. By the way, they knew that he was going down. They did their best to save him, but probably no one could. So the story of George Price is an incredible story, because in a sense, his own life is a reflection of the most of the deepest problematic of the problem of altruism in evolutionary theory, and that is, I think, this is my interpretation, I found some evidence for it in the papers that he left behind him, that one of the reasons that George took his life, and of course there are many, he was sick, he was not 100% normal, he wasn't taking his medicines because he thought that if he wouldn't take his medicines and he would be able to continue to do his work, then that would be a sign from above that God was approving of his work and so on. But some evidence suggests that what was very difficult for him was that he could not solve a problem that had been posed by Aristotle almost 2,400 years before. And that is the idea that the love that we feel for ourselves the love that we feel for others stems from the love that we feel for ourselves. And so the fundamental question of, is there such a thing as true selflessness? Or when we help others, are we doing it to some extent because it makes us feel good? And I think George the rationalist was unable to think of a scientific way to make a determination between these two options. And that was just too difficult for him because he could not know. He could not know the answer to this conundrum. And so left the world with the mystery. So in a way, that is the legacy of George Price, and it leaves a lot of room for discussion and philosophizing, because these are sorts of things that don't really do have clear-cut answers, but rather they have we can deal with them with wishes of the heart and with a kind of cultural or a philosophical agenda. But they aren't really answerable in a scientific sense. So that's George Price in short. It's now.
Can I come in there then and ask things? So thank you for that. That's really helpful in terms of, for me, getting a sense of this guy's. Because I wasn't familiar with this word before, and it's one of these people who quite clearly has influenced the development of so many different things in different ways, like you said, but the way in which he sort of had involvement in this, and this, and we've then focused on this idea of this enigma of altruism. And then, at least as well in the TED talk when you talk about some of these ideas as well, you distinguish between biological altruism and what you call their psychological altruism.
Right.
And is the idea that the discussion here is very much focused on biological altruism, or does it cover what you were calling there as also psychological altruism?
Right. So why don't we define the terms? So biological altruism is basically an altruist is any organism, and again, it could be an amoeba or a bacterium, or a plant, or a human being that confers a fitness benefit on another while incurring a fitness cost. So notice that definition is based on the result of one's behavior. If the result is that the person that you're trying to help is in fact helped in fitness terms, while you incur cost, then you are an altruist. So there's nothing here that has to do with intention. Psychological, and that's why an amoeba can be an altruist, because an amoeba doesn't have a brain, doesn't have intentions in the same way that we mean when we speak about intentions amongst humans. Humans, on the other hand, partake in what we call psychological altruism. And what we mean by that is that our intention is to do good by another, even if we pay some kind of price for it. And it's not defined necessarily by the result of that behavior. So this is an example that I gave, I think, in that talk. If an old lady asks you to cross the road and you help her, even if while doing so you are hit by a truck and you pay the ultimate price and are killed, and the result of your intervention is that the old lady made it to the other side of the road, so you actually helped her and you paid the ultimate price. If the old lady knows that you did so only because you knew that she was extremely rich and about to croak, then she will not view you as an altruist, even if you paid the ultimate price, and neither will most of us. So that just goes to sort of, to show that when we speak of altruism amongst humans, we really do mean the intention behind the behavior rather than the result. But of course, intentions are down to our brains and our bodies. They're not disembodied. And our bodies and our brains are the results of natural selection, among other things. They are what they are because they too have been, are the result of thousands upon thousands of generations of natural selection working on organic matter. And so there is some kind of connection between biological altruism on the one hand and psychological altruism on the other. And I think that George's story is, a most kind of dramatic realization of that connection. It's sort of it provides the most stark challenge to that connection, which must be there somewhere, but which we find difficult to really define in exact terms. biological altruism is easy. If an amoeba helps another amoeba, pays a price, it's an altruist. That's the easy case. The difficult case is with humans.
And this is again where I show my naivety in terms of the price equation.
Right.
That is aimed at trying to explain all forms of apparent altruistic behavior, whether it's from any type of organism, biological, psychological. Because again, you could argue those are somewhat blurry distinctions. But if we talk about this idea of intention, then the actual consequence isn't so much in terms of this helping. Because again, within psychology, we tend to, from my experience within social psychology and looking at so-called altruistic behaviors, we tend to step away from this idea of, well, we're not sure if it's genuinely altruistic. So we'll have terms like helping behavior, pro-social behavior, as ways of describing the kinds of things we see that may look like altruism, but we're not getting too caught into that discussion about is it genuinely altruistic or not. But the price equation is attempting to try to make sense and capture all of that elements of altruism?
No, I think that the price equation too is interested in just describing an altruistic behavior and seeing how it fares in a population over a number of generations, and how that whether that behavior can expand or contract, and what are the conditions that allow for its expansion. So he too didn't in the mathematics get into the question of whether it's real or not, but he did. Again, we spoke about his interpretation of the equation. The interpretation is to say, well, if something evolves, then it's doing good for some level of the biological hierarchy, whether it's at the level of the gene or the individual or the group. And so if it is utilitarian in that sense, it's actually improving the fitness of either the gene, the individual, or the group, then this is where the interpretation comes in. Then in what sense can we really speak of it as true selflessness? There's something very utilitarian about it. And this is where his interpretation comes in. Well, if that's the case, then I can't really think of this as true selflessness, because it is doing something. It is improving the fitness of some level of the biological hierarchy. And what his equation actually does is to tell you at what level of the biological hierarchy is natural selection working most strongly. And it has led to a new theory, which is now extremely sort of au courant and quite interesting and popular, which is multi-level selection theory, which is to say that actually selection is working at all levels of the biological hierarchy all the time. At the gene, at the level of the gene, the level of the individual, at the level of the group, maybe even at the level of the lineage. And in order to understand the fate of behavior such as altruism, we have to understand at what level is natural selection working most strongly. And then we can figure out what's happening to the behavior. So again, the interpretation of whether or not there is true kindness was something that sort of happened outside of the confines of the actual mathematics. That was happening in George Price's head, and it led to his death, perhaps. But it isn't part of the bones of the mathematics.
And that's and I'm going back to your TED Talk again, when you mention, I think it's in possibly your final slide. So again, pointing listeners to that if they haven't had a chance to listen to that one, where you'll hear some of what you've described today for us. In that final slide, this idea, his thoughts about love then, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was on a note that was found when somebody went into his flat after he died, and he had this idea about love, and it's something that does go beyond what we could try to capture within mathematics. Right. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I call it that he sort of he kind of crashed into what I call Wittgenstein's wall. Wittgenstein has this famous line in the Tractatus, in his famous Tractatus Philosophicus, in which he says, even if we answer all scientific questions, we still have not scratched the true basic fundamental problems of humanity. And at this stage, at that point, there are no more questions to ask, and that is precisely the answer. And so I think that we can say that to some degree, we have to understand which questions that matter to us are amenable to scientific exploration, and which questions, to some degree, exist outside of the purview of science and shouldn't be addressed with scientific tools because they cannot really be addressed meaningfully by these scientific tools. And I think that kindness is one of them, because even if we find the molecules which scientists of different kinds are looking for, they're looking for the places in the brain with fMRIs that light up when people perform altruistic acts. They're looking for the genes that are associated with kindness, among other things, among Buddhist monks. They're looking for the actual gene products, the enzymes that may play a role in what is called pro-social behavior in rats, and then ratchet it up. Perhaps there are analogs in humans. We know that there are analogs in humans. So there's an attempt nowadays, ever since Price killed himself in 1975, to really find the biological elements that are responsible for, to some degree, to kindness and for kindness. And there's something extremely reductive about that entire scientific program, as if we discover these things, then we will have some kind of, we'll be able to create a kind human being. We will have unmasked the mystery of sacrifice and selflessness. When in fact, it must be the case that that such behaviors, which are extremely complex, are much more complicated and have to do with relations between human beings and with the fact that we are social beings living in interaction with one another. It can't all be down to a reductive biology, although biology obviously plays a part in it, because there's no behavior for which biology doesn't play a part, just by dint of us being biological beings. We're not made out of tin foil or out of Lego. We're made out of organic material. And so that organic material does have obviously some mark on who we are and what we're able to do and what are the constraints of our behavior and our imaginations and so on. But it doesn't, if we're on the leash of biology and the leash is almost infinite, then what does it mean to say that we are held back by the leash of biology? Well, perhaps it doesn't mean all that much for the things that really matter to us.
And Oren, can I ask, because I'm mindful of the time, and maybe this is our longest podcast yet, and we just do the whole one all together because it all runs into one. But I mean, I was reading an article, Chance and Necessity Revisited, about Jacques Monod.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love Chance and Necessity. I think it's an amazing book. I mean, I'm an existentialist. I'm also an atheist. And I mean, Camus as well is one of my favorite writers. I mean, can I ask you the personal question? I mean, are you an existentialist then? Biology takes us a lot of the way there, but then we're still left. We see the machinery of the cell. We see the historical footprint of biology, but we still have these existential questions.
It's funny. I was an existentialist when I was 15, and I read Camus, and I fell in love with it. And I thought, wow, this is like so many others. And then I went through all kinds of different stages, and increasingly, I became a father about 2.5 years ago, and then again 8 months ago. And I find increasingly that I'm returning to existentialism, and returning to Camus. And finding again the great wisdom in that philosophy. I think that when you think sort of in cosmological terms, this is leaving biology for a moment and going to astrophysics. String theory posits 10 to the 500 universes, each of which has different laws of physics. And the universe that we live in just because it happens to have the conditions that allow for the creation of organic life, but not for any other reason. Is there a point to us being here? Well, probably in the grander picture and sort of, is there teleology in cosmology? I would say no. There's physics, there's gravity, there's angular momentum, and then there's the chemistry of life, which came about serendipitously and through a process of natural selection and evolution created us. Are we the pinnacle of anything? No, we are not. Were we the point of it all? No, we're not. And yet, life on this planet is all that we know and have. And so all the meaning resides in our hands. It's what we do with it. The fact that we're not here for any reason, there's no sort of man in the heavens or woman with a beard or without a beard, whatever, who is orchestrating this amazing symphony, doesn't mean that we cannot imbue our own lives with meaning, because obviously we can. We know that to be true by dint of living. And so, I do not become despondent by the larger sort of, cosmological considerations. Rather, I find it empowering that, you have one life to live and, and relationships to make with people and striving to, in your little piece of the world, to make it better and more equitable and peaceful and loving and less violent and less unfair. And that is a whole lot of meaning, no question. What degree our biology plays in this is an interesting question, and it may be more than academic. There are certain scholars, a colleague of mine from Harvard, who has written a book called Moral Tribes about the fact that because we evolved in small hunter-gatherer groups, then we're very good at being altruistic towards people within the group, but the sort of Janus face of that is that we're actually quite xenophobic, and that's to some degree kind of encoded in our biology. Well, maybe so, but the last 50 years of human civilization have proven that when we put our minds to it, we're also extremely good at finding reasons to give rights to people whom we thought were outside of the pale just 50 years ago, whether because they have a different color of skin or different, sexual proclivity. And so perhaps some things are more difficult than others. We have some kind of biological stamp on us, but it doesn't mean that it rules us in any way, and that we can't transcend it if it does exist. And so that's where meaning exists, making life, quite a wonder.
Absolutely. And I think maybe on that note, given the time, Louie, do you want to pause on that one?
I think that sounds brilliant.
And go on. Well, I'll be the first to say a massive thanks to Oren for joining us today. I'm hoping that you will join us again at some point, or let's consider that, because this is a space where I know Louie and I are finding it enormously valuable to touch base on so many of these different important ideas. And I think in the end that you have brought us back to these quick, big questions, which is where we start the podcast from, which is in some ways the nature of science and its role in asking these kinds of bigger existential questions, and leading us to that place of, at the very least, wonder whether you see there's any point to it all or not. So I want to thank you for that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you too.
Thank you for joining us, Oren. It was absolutely brilliant.
Wonderful. Have a great day, guys.
And you too.
And you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.